We often think of power as something that is shouted from rooftops or written into law, but for the British monarchy, the most potent forms of authority have always been the ones you can barely see. When the news of Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor's arrest broke on that cold February morning, the world expected a roar, a scandal, a public unraveling of a family that has spent centuries guarding its own. But instead, we got a meticulously crafted silence, a silence that was broken only by a single, surgically precise sentence. The law must take its course. It's a line that sounds almost humble on the surface, but when you look closer, you realize it's actually the most significant institutional pivot we've seen in a generation. King Charles wasn't just talking about a police investigation, he was performing a ritual of separation. He was telling the public that the person who shared his nursery and his blood is no longer under the protection of the shield that covers the rest of the firm. It makes you wonder, though, is this a genuine move toward transparency? Or is it just the ultimate survival instinct of an institution that knows it can no longer afford to protect everyone? To understand why this moment feels so heavy, you have to look back at the decades of shadows that led us here. For years, the monarchy operated under a very different set of unwritten rules. Rules that prioritized the protection of the brand above almost everything else. The Epstein files didn't just appear out of nowhere, they were a slow-moving storm that the palace had been trying to outrun for a very long time. But now that the Thames Valley Police have actually crossed the threshold of the Sandringham estate, the old ways of doing business have become a liability. Honestly, the shift we're seeing isn't just about one man's legal troubles. It's about a king who has realized that the only way to save the crown is to allow the law to dismantle a piece of it. It's a cold, calculated form of house cleaning that Charles has been forced to undertake, and he's doing it with a level of clinical detachment that would have been unthinkable under his mother's reign. The question being raised by many observers is whether this new, more ruthless version of the monarchy is what the public actually wants, or if it just exposes how fragile the whole structure has become. Look, the way Charles is using the trappings of his office right now is nothing short of fascinating. While the investigation into Andrew dominates the headlines, the king is busy projecting a very specific kind of normalcy. He's showing up to engagements, he's making surprise appearances on front pages, and he's using royal fashion as a coded language of stability. When you see him in a perfectly tailored suit, standing tall at a public event while his brother is effectively under house arrest at Wood Farm, you're not just seeing a man at work, you're seeing a masterclass in institutional resilience. Those who have followed this story closely are now asking whether these public displays are a deliberate attempt to distract us from the fact that the monarchy spent decades potentially shielding the very behavior that is now being investigated. It's a classic case of the palace using the good royals to create a protective barrier around the institution, hoping that if we see enough of Kate and William's steady presence, we might forget the systemic failures that allowed the Andrew crisis to reach this point. Here's the thing that really gets me. The king's personal statement wasn't just a PR move, it was a constitutional gamble. By signing it personally, Charles took a rare and extremely grave step. He didn't hide behind a palace spokesperson or an unnamed source. He put his own name on the line to say that his brother is on his own. It's a move that NBC News rightly described as showing just how grave the situation truly is. But you have to ask yourself, why now? Why is the law only being allowed to take its course after years of public outcry and mounting evidence? Rumors have begun circulating that the palace knew an arrest was imminent weeks before it happened, and that this entire strategy of studied composure was rehearsed and ready to go before the police even arrived at Sandringham. It makes you realize that even the king's honesty is part of a larger, much more complex game of survival, where every word is weighed for its ability to preserve the status quo. You see, the real mystery here isn't just about what Andrew did, it's about what the institution allowed to happen while he was under their protection. Every time we see a headline about royal fashion or a surprise appearance, we're being invited to look at the surface of the monarchy, not its engine. Speculation is growing that the investigation could widen to include former protection officers and staff who served Andrew over the years. If that happens, the palace's current strategy of silence will be put to its ultimate test. What public discussion has increasingly suggested is that the monarchy's crisis is no longer just reputational, it's constitutional. Can an institution that asks for public funding and public trust really survive if it's proven that it spent decades operating a parallel system of accountability for its own members? It's a question that Charles is trying to answer by being the most law-abiding king in history. But for many people, the clean break he's trying to make feels like it might be coming too late. The energy behind the Republican movement in the UK right now is different than it was 5 years ago. It's not just about abstract ideas of democracy anymore. It's about a very specific anger toward a system that seems to protect privilege at any cost. Insiders have long speculated that Charles is deeply aware of this shift in the national mood. That's why his statement had no expression of family sympathy, no reference to innocence, and no solidarity. He's trying to separate the family from the firm in the public mind. But honestly, can you ever really separate the two? When you're talking about an institution where the bloodline is the entire point, a criminal investigation into a member of that bloodline is an attack on the foundations of the whole thing. The Guardian's analysis of how royal fashion is being used as a political tool during this crisis shows just how much effort is being put into maintaining the illusion of a steady, unwavering crown. But beneath the well-pressed suits and the coordinated public visits, the cracks are becoming impossible to ignore. Look, get this. The YouGov polling data actually shows a modest uptick in Charles's approval ratings since the arrest. It's a bizarre twist, right? It suggests that the public is actually rewarding the king for turning his back on his brother. But that's a dangerous game for a monarch to play. If your popularity is based on how well you can distance yourself from your own family's scandals, what happens when the next scandal hits closer to home? The question being raised by many observers is whether this strategy of studied composure is a sustainable way to lead, or if it's just a temporary shield that will eventually shatter. Unconfirmed reports point to the possibility that more unsealed documents from the U.S. could implicate other associates close to the royal household, which would make Charles's current clean break strategy look increasingly like a desperate attempt to contain a fire that has already spread too far. The human cost of all this is often what gets buried under the weight of the institutional analysis. We talk about Andrew as a legal problem to be solved, but we rarely talk about the culture that allowed him to feel untouchable for so long. We don't talk about the staff who were told to look the other way, or the protection officers who were caught between their duty to the law and their duty to the prince. What many observers now believe is that the Andrew crisis represents a systemic failure of accountability that goes far beyond one man's choices. It's about a culture of protected privilege that Charles is now trying to dismantle with one hand, while he tries to preserve the aura of the monarchy with the other. It's a contradiction that's becoming harder and harder to manage, especially as the social reaction on platforms like X and Reddit continues to move toward a much more radical demand for transparency. Honestly, the way the BBC has been tracking the engagement on this story is telling. It's the highest reader engagement they've ever seen for a non-death royal event. People aren't just curious, they're demanding answers. They're watching Charles to see if he really means it when he says the law must take its course. But what does that actually look like in practice? Does it mean the king will cooperate with a formal inquiry into the palace's role in shielding his brother? Or does it just mean he'll stay out of the way of the police while the palace lawyers work behind the scenes to limit the damage? The narrative forming around this is one of a monarchy that is trying to be just enough transparent to avoid a total collapse of public trust, without actually opening up its books or its history to the kind of scrutiny that any other public institution would face. The role of Kate and William in all of this is perhaps the most critical part of the king's plan. They are the faces of the future, the steady presence that is supposed to reassure us that the monarchy is still a force for good. Kate's recent visit to Wales and William's increased schedule of engagements are being read by insiders as a coordinated strategy to project continuity in the face of catastrophe. It's a heavy burden for the next generation to carry, to be the PR shield for a crisis they didn't create. But this is how the monarchy has always worked. It sacrifices the individual to save the institution. Voices across public forums have begun to wonder whether this constant need to project stability is actually preventing the family from having the honest, painful conversations that might actually lead to real reform. Instead of talking about the crisis, they're being told to wear the right color and smile for the cameras. It's a strategy that has worked for 100 years, but in 2026, it's starting to feel incredibly hollow. Wait, think about the financial aspect for a second. The Crown Estate and the monarchy's broader funding are being scrutinized in a way we haven't seen since the 90s. When the public sees millions of pounds being spent on legal fees and security for a man under investigation, the value for money argument for the monarchy starts to fall apart. Speculation is growing that the king might use this crisis as an excuse to finally push through the slimmed-down monarchy he's been talking about for years. It would be a convenient way to remove the problematic members of the family while appearing to be responsive to public concerns about taxpayer support. But even a slimmed-down monarchy still relies on the idea of inherited privilege, and that's the part of the foundation that the Andrew crisis has most deeply damaged. You can't just cut off a few branches and expect the tree to stand if the roots are being questioned. What this moment reveals about the monarchy is its incredible, almost terrifying ability to adapt. Charles has watched his family survive world wars, divorces, and the death of Diana, and he's learned the most important lesson of all. You have to be willing to let go of anyone who threatens the survival of the crown. But this time, the threat is coming from inside the house in a way that's much more difficult to manage. The law, taking its course, isn't just a legal process. It's a public trial of the monarchy's moral authority. Every surprise appearance and every fashion choice is a desperate attempt to win that trial in the court of public opinion. But as the investigation into Andrew continues to dominate the news cycle, the palace is finding that the old magic of royal theater isn't as effective as it used to be. The audience has seen behind the curtain, and they're not sure they like what they see. The question being raised by many observers is whether we're witnessing the end of the untouchable royal. If the king's own brother can be arrested and investigated like any other citizen, then the whole idea of royal exceptionalism starts to dissolve. And once that's gone, what's left? If the king is just another man who has to obey the law, why do we need a king at all? This is the paradox at the heart of Charles's strategy. By trying to save the monarchy through accountability, he might be inadvertently proving that the monarchy is no longer necessary. It's a high-wire act with no safety net, and every step he takes, every statement he signs, and every event he attends is a calculated move to prevent a fall that feels more possible now than at any point in his life. Honestly, looking at the way The Guardian's piece on royal fashion exploded with 250,000 reads, you can see how much we all want to believe in the codes and the secrets of the monarchy. We want to believe there's a deeper meaning to the king's choice of tie or the color of Kate's coat. But the uncomfortable truth is that these codes are often just a way to avoid talking about the things that actually matter. While we're busy decoding fashion choices, the police are decoding decades of financial records and travel logs. The gap between the royal story we're being told and the legal reality that's unfolding is becoming a chasm. And at some point, no amount of careful messaging or surprise appearances will be enough to bridge it. The public is waking up to the fact that the civilized surface of the monarchy has been hiding a very different kind of reality for a very long time. We have to consider the political implications of Charles's statement as well. By preempting calls for a parliamentary inquiry, he's trying to keep the power of investigation within the royal orbit. He knows that if Parliament gets a real look at how the palace has operated over the last 30 years, the damage could be permanent. So he says the law must take its course, hoping that the law will stay focused on Andrew and not look too closely at the institutional framework that supported him. It's a defensive move disguised as an act of courage. But those who have followed this story closely are now asking whether the government will actually be satisfied with this, or if the pressure from both Labour and Conservative MPs will eventually force the king to reveal more than he ever intended. I mean, look at the way the public discourse has shifted from shock to a somber reckoning. People aren't just angry, they're disillusioned. They feel like they've been sold a version of the monarchy that doesn't actually exist. They were told it was an institution of service and moral leadership, but the Andrew crisis suggests it's an institution of self-preservation and hidden privilege. Charles is trying to fix this by being the king who obeys the law, but he's fighting against decades of a very different kind of history. The narrative he's trying to build is one of a modern, accountable monarchy, but it's being built on a foundation that was designed to be anything but accountable. It's a race against time to see if he can rebuild the crown's image before the weight of the investigation pulls the whole thing down. The expected developments over the next 48 hours are going to be crucial. Charles is expected to make another carefully timed appearance, and you can bet it will be designed to project as much solidity and continuity as possible. Every detail will be managed, every word will be scripted, and every camera angle will be chosen to make him look like a man who is in total control of his house. But the real story will be happening in the rooms we can't see, where the lawyers and the police are sifting through the evidence that the palace hoped would never see the light of day. The civilized front of the monarchy is being tested like never before, and for the first time, it feels like the outcome is truly uncertain. In the end, we're left with a king who is trying to lead his people through a catastrophe by saying as little as possible. He's betting that silence and symbolism will be enough to win back a public that has been deeply hurt by the actions of his family. But as the Andrew crisis continues to expand, that bet looks increasingly risky. The law is taking its course, and it's not just Andrew who is on trial. It's the entire idea of the monarchy in the 21st century. Can an institution based on inherited power really survive in an age of total accountability? Charles thinks he can make it work, but the world is watching. And for once, the palace doesn't have the final say on how this story ends. The silence that Charles has adopted is perhaps his most powerful weapon, but it's also his greatest weakness. It allows him to avoid the messiness of the legal details, but it also makes him look detached from the very real pain and anger that the public is feeling. While he stands in his perfectly tailored suits, projecting a studied composure, the rest of the country is having a much louder, much more difficult conversation about what the monarchy should actually be. The gap between the king's silence and the people's noise is where the future of the crown will be decided. And as we wait for the next surprise appearance or the next carefully worded statement, we have to ask ourselves, how much longer can this institution survive on symbols alone? The law must take its course is a phrase that will likely define Charles's reign. It's a line that marks the end of an era of protection and the beginning of an era of consequences. But for the people who have watched this institution protect itself for decades, the question remains, is the king actually letting the law take its course, or is he just managing the speed and direction of the fallout? As the investigation moves forward, the answer to that question will become clear, and it will change the way we see the British monarchy forever. The era of the untouchable royal is over, but what comes next is a mystery that even the king himself might not be able to solve. Is King Charles's strategy of studied composure and symbolic silence a sign of genuine leadership? Or is it just the latest version of a centuries-old survival tactic designed to protect the institution at any cost?